A. Minimal context, when safety becomes an assumption rather than a question. In high-safety systems, failure rarely emerges as a reckless decision or an obvious violation of rules. Instead, it takes shape through a quieter process. Risk is not denied, it is gradually accepted. No one in the system explicitly claims that conditions are absolutely safe, yet over time, behavior begins to reflect the assumption that existing risks are sufficiently acceptable to require no change. Risk does not disappear, it simply loses its urgency. This is the starting point of a well-documented mechanism in decision science and institutional analysis, the normalization of deviance. The mechanism is especially dangerous in domains where severe accidents are rare, past success is treated as evidence of correct design, the costs of reform are immediate and tangible, while the benefits remain hypothetical. Under these conditions, the central question quietly shifts from, "Is this risky?" to, "Have we lived with this risk long enough to treat it as normal?" 2. The decision environment. Why risk is easier to normalize than to eliminate. To understand why high-safety systems drift toward normalized risk, we must examine the organizational environment in which decisions are made. 1. Rare disasters distort risk intuition. Humans and institutions do not assess risk through statistical probability alone. They assess it through imaginability. Events that fail to occur over long periods gradually fade from operational imagination. When a hazardous configuration persists for years without catastrophe, it is quietly reinterpreted as evidence of acceptability, not because anyone declares it safe, but because no one feels compelled to question it anymore. 2. Chronic risk always loses to acute risk. Organizations respond effectively to acute risk, visible incidents, media pressure, immediate harm. They respond poorly to chronic risk, slow, diffuse, and painless in the short term. Chronic risk does not trigger emergency protocols or decisive intervention. It becomes something to be managed, not removed. The system learns to optimize convenience rather than safety. 3. Reform carries real costs. Safety delivers hypothetical benefits. Every organizational change carries certain costs: budgetary strain, institutional friction, political exposure. By contrast, the benefits of added safety are counterfactual, something that does not happen. No one is rewarded for a disaster that never occurs. This creates a structural imbalance. Costs are guaranteed, benefits are abstract. 3. The core failure mechanism. Normalization as a rational process. It is essential to emphasize, normalization of deviance is not negligence. It is the outcome of a series of incremental adjustments, each of which appears reasonable when made. 1. From exception to routine. Hazardous configurations rarely begin as standards. They emerge as exceptions, temporary, context-dependent, conditional. When these exceptions produce no immediate harm, they are repeated, legitimized, and eventually become routine. The transition from exception to norm is rarely marked by a formal decision. It occurs through familiarity. 2. Past success becomes justification for present risk. Each successful operation under risky conditions sends a misleading signal that the configuration is acceptable. Over time, accident-free history is no longer interpreted as luck. It becomes implicit proof of correctness. Risk is not denied, it is reframed. 3. Warnings become noise. In environments without disaster, repeated warnings tend to be perceived as overly cautious, impractical, disproportionate. This creates a paradox. The more warnings occur without catastrophe, the less seriously warnings are taken. 4. Responsibility drifts across time. No individual ever decides to accept a deadly risk. Instead, each actor merely refrains from reversing inherited practices. Responsibility thus resides not in action, but in prolonged inaction, a form of accountability that institutions are structurally ill-equipped to assign. 4. Structural parallels beyond aviation. Normalization of deviance is not unique to aviation. It appears where three conditions coexist: high complexity, rare failure, and historical success. 1. Engineering and industrial systems. Major industrial disasters frequently reveal hazardous conditions that were known, documented, and tolerated for years because they had not yet produced visible failure. 2. Healthcare systems. In hospitals,
Small deviations from protocol are often justified by experience and efficiency. Over time, the boundary between flexibility and danger erodes. 3. Public policy and societal risk. Climate change, infrastructure decay, and financial instability all share the same structure: clear warnings, slow response, and prolonged normalization until costs become unavoidable. 5. Broader implications. Why systems learn the wrong lessons from success. The core problem is not that systems fail to learn, but that they learn incorrectly. 1. Success conceals danger. Each cycle of successful operation under hazardous conditions reinforces the belief that risk has been controlled, when in reality it has merely remained dormant. 2. Reform follows catastrophe, not foresight. Systemic change typically occurs only after the cost of an action exceeds the cost of reform. By then, learning becomes reactive rather than preventative. 3. No reward structure for prevention. Most institutions lack mechanisms to recognize or reward the prevention of events that never occur. As a result, prevention remains an ethical choice rather than an institutional priority. Open conclusion. A question for all high-safety systems. This analysis leads to an unresolved but critical question. How can a system distinguish between has not happened yet and cannot happen before paying the price to learn the difference? As long as safety is treated as a default state rather than a process that must be continuously challenged, normalization of deviance will remain not an anomaly, but an inevitable outcome.